What's up, world? Welcome back to another episode of Just Grow It, the podcast. I'm your host, Big City Gardener, and today we are talking about powdery mildew, how to prevent it, how to treat it, and what is it? Let's get it. Have you ever been growing squash or cucumbers and noticed this white film on the leaves of the plants? Well, more than likely, that is powdery mildew that you are seeing. Powdery mildew is an extremely common fungal disease that you will often see in your garden. It's unsightly, and if left unchecked, it can destroy your entire garden. So, what exactly is powdery mildew? Powdery mildew is a fungus that affects a wide variety of vegetables, fruits, and flowers. As a matter of fact, it can affect all different types of plants. Now, when I said it is a fungus, I'm not saying that it is one specific type of fungus. As a matter of fact, powdery mildew can be caused by many different varieties of fungi. Powdery mildew looks like white spots on leaves. A few spots of powdery mildew is not a big deal, but an advanced infestation has the power to stress and damage not just the one plant you see the mildew on, but your entire garden. But don't worry, it is possible to control powdery mildew and even prevent it from forming in the first place. Now, let's talk about how powdery mildew spreads. Unlike squash vine borer, powdery mildew is in every single growing climate. Unfortunately, it thrives in warm and humid growing conditions. So, if you happen to live down here in the Gulf Coast or anywhere where we have high humidity and warm temperatures, you are more likely to experience powdery mildew than other locations. Powdery mildew lives on plants, it can overwinter in our soil, and worst of all, it can be spread to our compost pile. This is why it is important to make sure we get rid of any powdery mildew that we see. But do not throw it into your compost pile. What you're going to want to do is to completely get it off of your property. Bag it up and put it out with the rest of your trash. Powdery mildew spreads through spores. Now, these spores can be spread by pollinators, they can be spread by the wind, or they can be spread by watering. Crowded growing conditions, which lead to a lack of airflow and excessive amounts of shade, are the ideal recipe for powdery mildew. So, what exactly does powdery mildew look like? Powdery mildew looks like white or gray spots on the leaves. Powdery mildew first shows itself as tiny little spots, usually found on the new growth. But if you have a serious infestation, what it looks like is that your plant's leaves have been dipped in flour or powdered sugar. Don't confuse powdery mildew with downy mildew. Downy mildew looks like yellow spots that eventually turn brown, crunchy, and form holes in the leaves. Now, how does powdery mildew harm our plants? Powdery mildew is a fungus. And fungus has the capability of robbing the host plant of nutrients. Powdery mildew tends to leave plants stunted and less productive. Now, when powdery mildew infestations are bad and powdery mildew coats the leaves, what ends up happening is photosynthesis is inhibited. A plant is not able to convert the sunlight into the necessary food because the receptors are cloaked or covered by this powdery mildew. Now, like I mentioned earlier, a little bit of powdery mildew isn't that big of a deal. But if we leave it unchecked, we will run into a bigger problem. Now, what plants are commonly affected by powdery mildew? Many of our most common vegetables and flowers can be affected by powdery mildew. This list includes things like summer squash, pumpkins, gourds, cucumbers, melons, tomatoes, eggplants, carrots, well, really the tops on the carrots, sunflowers, lettuce, apples, roses, zinnias, and even calendula. Now, what I've noticed over the years is that there tend to be some plants that seem to be somewhat resistant to powdery mildew. This includes things like citrus trees, figs, avocados, basil, sage, lavender, thyme, oregano, mint. A lot of your herbs seem to be somewhat powdery mildew resistant. Now, if you decide to grow a plant like summer squash that is extremely susceptible to powdery mildew, what I recommend is looking for a variety that has been bred to be powdery mildew resistant. Now that we've talked about what powdery mildew is, how it forms, and how it's spread, let's talk about 7 different ways that you can help prevent powdery mildew. 1. Plant species and varieties that are powdery mildew resistant. 2. Practice proper plant spacing. Now, everyone knows I love to plant intensively, and that means plants extremely close and touching each other. But with certain plants that are susceptible to powdery mildew, such as squash, tomatoes, cucumbers, I want to make sure that I follow the spacing requirements. That way, the plants have sufficient airflow and we are less likely to have a powdery mildew issue. Number 3, in my opinion, this should probably be number 1. Do not compost infected plants. Powdery mildew is a fungus, so if we cut down a plant that is covered in powdery mildew and throw it into our compost pile, what ends up happening is we are now spreading these fungal spores all throughout our compost. Rather than throwing the infected plant into our compost bin, what you're going to want to do is bag it up in a trash bag and get it as far away from your property as quickly as possible. Number 4, clean your garden tools. Look, I'm going to keep saying it. Powdery mildew is a fungus. The fungus is spread through spores. These spores are all over your tools. So if I'm using a pair of pruners and I'm pruning back an infected plant, I want to make sure that I clean my tools with vinegar, rubbing alcohol, diluted bleach, hydrogen peroxide, anything like that before moving to the next plant. Number 5, apply water directly to the soil and not to the plant leaves. We mentioned this earlier. Powdery mildew is a fungus, and this fungus is spread through spores. So if I'm watering my garden and I'm spraying water on the leaves, and I have these fungal spores on the leaves, what can end up happening is as I spray my plant leaves, the water hits the leaves, catches some of those fungal spores, and then takes them to the next plant. So by applying the water directly to the soil, we can help avoid spreading powdery mildew throughout our garden. Number 6, apply compost teas regularly. Compost teas provide plants with nutrients that they need to grow big and strong. Big, strong, healthy plants are usually stronger and more pest and disease resistant. Number 7, you can treat your plants with neem oil. Before we even notice a powdery mildew issue, we could step outside and spray our garden with neem oil once every week and a half. This regular application can help prevent things like powdery mildew from even forming in our garden. Now that we talked about 7 ways to prevent powdery mildew, let's talk about 5 different ways that we can deal with powdery mildew in our garden. Number 1, remove infected leaves. After you cut and remove these leaves, make sure that we do not add them to our compost bin, and make sure to clean your pruners after the cuts. Number 2, spray your plant with a baking soda water mixture. Mix 1 tablespoon of baking soda with 1 tablespoon of Castile soap and dissolve this in 1 gallon of water. Then apply this liquid all over your plant. I recommend applying this liquid early in the day or at the end of the day. We want to avoid spraying our plants during the middle of the day when the sun is at its peak. Number 3, use potassium bicarbonate. Potassium bicarbonate works very similar to the baking soda mixture. It helps prevent the fungus from ever occupying or living on the leaves, and it lasts longer than the baking soda mixture does. Number 4, apply neem oil regularly. Number 5 is simply remove infected plants from your garden before they have the opportunity to spread and pass the disease through the garden. Like I mentioned, a little bit of powdery mildew in your garden won't kill anybody. As a matter of fact, it's to be expected. By being present in our garden on a daily basis, we'll be able to catch the powdery mildew before it is able to turn into a full-blown infestation. That's it for this episode of Just Grow It, the podcast. I'm your host, Big City Gardener. Now check it out. Before I let you go, I do have an ask. If you found any value or you enjoyed this episode, then what I need for you to do is to head over to wherever you listen to this podcast and give me a 5-star review and leave a comment. Look, man, I'm on a mission, and that mission is to turn Just Grow It, the podcast into a top 10 gardening podcast this year, and I can only do it with your help. So, after you've left a review, please share this episode with as many people as you possibly can. I won't be mad if you share it with everybody in your contact list. That's it. Thanks for everything. Thanks for checking out this episode of Just Grow It, the podcast. Now, what I need you to do is to step outside. Check out all of your plants. Make sure you don't have any powdery mildew going on. Then, listen to the episodes with the planting schedule. Find out what you should be growing in your area at this time. Get some seeds, get some transplants, get out in the garden, and just grow it. You guys take it easy.